Thanks for coming. My first time in Washington, other than the airport, so that's fun. I don't know. It seems like a lot of people are from Washington at this conference. Good, great conference, lots of people. That's really good. We'll talk about horizontal DevOps today and making success repeatable. So we'll try to unpack that a little bit in the first few slides and talk about what exactly horizontal DevOps is compared to DevOps, which probably you all know what that is. That's me. I'm Geoff St. Pierre, and I'm a husband and a father, and sometimes I have to convince the people that I'm husband and father to that I'm not a robot, so they told me to put that on the slide to, I guess sometimes I come off as robotic. But I'm also human, and I'm a web developer, and I'm a Drupalist. And I work on LANDO as a maintainer and core committer, and that's an open source project that provides a local development environment based on Docker. I'm a Backdrop CMS core committer. Backdrop CMS is a fork of Drupal, which largely preserves the Drupal 7 API, and that's also an open source project. I'm passionate about open source. I just love to work in open source communities and make contributions. I don't necessarily stick to one community at all times. I work in Backdrop and I work in LANDO, I work in Drupal, and I contribute to all of those things. I'm a singer-songwriter, and that's supposed to make you feel like I'm human as well. Yeah, so a lot of the, did you guys go to the keynote? I'm sure some of you went to the keynote. So a lot of those points about open source and community really spoke to me, and I'm passionate about open source, so you'll hear some of those points echoed in this presentation. So traditional DevOps, as I think of it, is like, how do we produce the operations, the technical, the servers and the things that are going to serve this application to the users? How do we construct that technology stack that is the right stack for this application that we're going to deliver to the users? So that's often, I think of that as one vertical stack for one application, maybe one ecosystem of websites and applications that are going to have a front-facing experience for the user. How do we construct that tech stack to make that work? So there's the vertical stacks. Here's some things that are exemplary of what might be in your stack. You might have, Xdebug for your developers to debug the application. You might have Gulp to manage the front-end assets. You might have Bhat to ensure that the application does the things you say it's going to do. And then you might have Travis CI to run all of those things before you deploy to production. So that's a vertical stack. There could be lots of other things in there. It could be without those things, but different things, but that's one vertical stack for one application. That's what I think of as traditional DevOps. And you're going to have a DevOps team or DevOps person for every application that you build. So horizontal DevOps is not that vertical stack, so it's scaling out horizontally. That's where the word horizontal comes in. So there's a couple different ways you can think of this horizontal stuff. You could be an agency or a department or an IT department that has multiple projects that you have to manage. You might have, if you have the luxury of working on exactly one project, one website, then that's fantastic. And that means you spend 100% of your time making sure that that's a great product and great user experience, and you make that. Then you basically have that one vertical stack, and you just make sure that that's pristine and as best as possible. But if you have multiple projects, which almost everybody that I know does, and that could be one person going across multiple projects, that could be a team of 25 people that 5 people are on this project and 7 people are on this project, but out of those 5 people, like there might be 3 overlapping in 2 different projects. So how do they switch between those projects? That might be, they might switch between those on day to day, they might switch between those in a year. How do you keep these people efficient and working when you have these multiple projects? So you might have, n number of projects. So each of the projects has their own vertical stack, has their traditional DevOps, the things that you need to make that project work. And if you made a project, 5 or 6 years ago, that was probably, if you're doing a Drupal project, that's probably, a Drupal 7 project, and the things that you needed to make that happen might be like Git and Drush and Drupal, and that might have been it, or even less possibly. But then you get more projects over the years, but you don't abandon your first client or your first project. You might have to go back and do maintenance on that project or additional feature requests. So your next project, might be Drupal 7, but it has Drush 8 because Drush 8 came out, and then you're using Gulp to manage your SaaS and your front-end assets, which maybe you didn't do on your first project. Then your third project comes along and you use Grunt. Maybe you inherited it and it had Grunt. Maybe you chose to use Grunt, but that's a difference. So the green there is just and call out that that's a difference between these vertical stacks. So one project has Gulp, one project has Grunt, and then the next project, maybe you go back to Gulp because you didn't like Grunt, or Gulp was a better choice, whatever the reasons are. So now you have these vertical stacks that have different tools in them. And you have to figure out how to manage that. And then, maybe this last project is a Drupal 8 project and you have Composer in it, and then you introduce BHAT because maybe you've been burnt by deploying bad code that broke the website or something like that. So as you grow, you have these differing stacks on your different projects, and you still have to manage. So you might have to jump into that first project to do a maintenance request or a feature request or something like that. And how do you deal with that? Like if one project has Gulp and one project has Grunt. So this whole thing of horizontal DevOps is hopefully going to give you a way to deal with it. There are many ways. You could just, has anyone ever had to switch between a project that had Gulp or Grunt or an NPM dependency or a Ruby dependency and lost a day of productivity because you had to figure out your Ruby on your local machine or anything like that?
Right here.
One person only? Yeah, exactly. DevOps people that are shy to raise their hands, I'm sure. So that's trying to unpack the difference between what I consider regular DevOps, a vertical stack, and horizontal. So what we're going to try to do is prevent that dev oops. So when you have to switch back to that first project that was using Compass to manage the SaaS versus Gulp to manage the SaaS, and then you go to that project and it's supposed to be like an hour tweak to like fix the CSS or something, but you realize that your Ruby's not working on your machine and you lose a day or an hour or whatever it is that you lose. Nobody likes to lose time. The client doesn't like it. You don't like it. It's frustrating and doesn't make anybody happy. So we're going to try to prevent the dev oops. We're going to try to see some ways to manage this. So here's what I hope that you take away. Your takeaways might be different, and that's totally fine, but this is what I'm going for. So don't be afraid of change. Like technologies are changing. There's Gulp, there's Grunt, and to say that one of those things is better or worse than the other is like not really true, but they all come along and they all serve their purpose, and they certainly, at the time that the engineer picks those things, have their place in a project. They are the right choice for that project. And there's lots of change in tech. We all know this. So don't be afraid of change. Having said that, don't change too quickly. I think Adam Nerdstein mentioned this in his talk. Don't change for the sake of change. Like sometimes developers, myself included, are like, "Ooh, new fancy thing. Let's grab it and use it in project." And that can be lots of fun, but sometimes that's not the right choice for the client or the project at hand. So don't be afraid to change, but don't change too quickly. So yes, continuously evaluate these tools, but don't throw them into production project right away. So once you introduce that change, try new tool like on your own or in a development environment on a project, and then measure it. Like, is this better? Did changing to Gulp make this project better, more efficient? Is it, measure those kinds of things. And if the measurement of that thing proves itself more useful than the previous thing, then document, how did you do that? How did you get it into the project? How does the end user, which might be other developers on your team, how do they use it? Like, just because you know how to use it and you figured it out, you can't just hand that off to your 5 developers, and, maybe a front-end developer who didn't set it up, and expect them to figure it out. You could do that, but that's not nice, and certainly not efficient. So once you make this choice, you test it, you decide it's a good choice, so document it so that somebody else can use that tool, whether that's Gulp or Grunt or BHAT or whatever it is. And then once you have that documented, then roll that out to your team. So this is, a pretty typical, like you can see that you would do this on a feature request for any project. So I'm just saying, do the same things that you would do on a feature request. The feature request comes in, make your changes to the code, test your changes, make sure it works, document it, deploy it. So I'm suggesting you use that same kind of implementation in your DevOps. That's what I'm suggesting for this slide. So I hope that that's what you get out of this, and maybe you already know that. So the majority of what this talk is going to be about, there's lots of, in your vertical DevOps, there's lots of things about deploying to production, make sure things are working and don't crash your production site or application before it gets there. So a large part of this talk is going to be about the horizontal part is local development. So how do we manage all these things before they get to production? How do we develop? How do we jump between teams or projects and that kind of stuff? So, in 1998 or 96, I actually heard someone in line say that they inherited an application that was HTML and FTP. So that was a thing that maybe a lot of us did. I did it. I don't. Maybe some of you are too young to have ever done that. But we wrote HTML, and in some cases, I literally wrote HTML on the server. Like there was no deploy mechanism. I went into the file, I opened Vim, and I changed the things I needed to do, and that was live. Like that just happened. But that wasn't PHP. That was just HTML. And then PHP came along. At some point, when applications got complex and the web became more of a robust, it's not just an information distribution channel anymore. You literally have interactive applications on the web now, which is what we in this room probably do every day. So we started making local stacks, and basically at first that mimicked exactly what was on the server, but we put it on our local machine, right? And that was great because it's really fast and you can do anything you want, and you're not affecting the production application. The production application sits out there on the web, serving to the users, and you're making changes, and you're not breaking the user experience. You're figuring out what you're going to implement, and that's also fast. But it's a bit hard to maintain because the person that does that on a local computer has to have that stack on their computer somehow, and either they have to put it there or some DevOps person has to put it there. And that makes it fairly rigid. So, for example, if you're working in Drupal and you put a LAMP stack on your local computer, you have to have Linux or Unix and Apache, MySQL, and PHP, and you have to have those things on your computer, and they have to get there somewhere. That might be by brew install. That might be there's choices to be made there. Like, how do you get those things onto your local computer? And it's almost impossible to share. It's not impossible, but the way to share it is basically have your DevOps guy go from if you have a team of 5, go to the 5 computers and set it up. And there's fairly sophisticated ways that you can do that. You can make an image, and all developers get this machine that's imaged with these specific tools. So it's not easy to share, it's not impossible to share, but it certainly requires the effort of some team member or team members to make that scale across your team. So the next thing that came along was a virtualized stack, VMs. So a way to make this happen that addresses some of those problems. How many people are using VMs now or have used VMs for local development? Oh, quite a few, at least 2/3. Fantastic. And this is a great solution. So these are things like Vagrant and Drupal VM, which they solve some of these problems. They are encapsulated. So if you have 2 projects and they're on 2 different VMs, the one VM doesn't affect the other VM. So if one project has PHP 5.6 and one project has PHP 7.0, that's okay. And you don't have to swap that out on your local machine, which there are ways to do that on your local machine back in the LAMP stack, but it's not super easy, it's not super seamless, and it affects project 1 and project 2. So if you go from project 2 to project 1, you have to switch back that PHP version, otherwise you're not working on the same stack as the server, or possibly other devs, and that can make the scenario where it works on my machine, but you deploy it live and it breaks. So the VM solves that problem. One of the things, so some of the things about that are it's heavy. So each VM has to have its own dedicated disk space and RAM, and that's what that diagram underneath here is showing, that you have your host operating system, and then every project has a guest OS and the libraries and then the app sitting in it. So if you dedicate 2 gigabytes of RAM on a 16 gigabyte machine and you have 2 apps running and they both are dedicated 2 gigs, then they're both taking 4 gigs of RAM, and that's how that goes. So you can manage that, but have any of you ever had 3 virtual machines running on your development environment at once? What happens?
That's all you get to have in your local machine.
That's all you can have. Your fan starts going, shh. Did anybody ever just have their machine actually shut off on them? Shh, boom. I have. So that's fine if you just run one at a time, shut it off, turn on the other one. Totally fine. And if you're in a virtualized stack now, what I would say is, if that's working for you, that's fantastic. Don't change too quickly. Examine the other possibilities and move slowly. So the third thing where a lot of local dev is now, and where a lot of development in general is getting attention, is of course containers. So we're using containerized stacks on our local machines, and that's basically Docker for the most part, but it doesn't have to be Docker. LXC is the other one that I know of. There may be others, but so this has some advantages. It's lighter than a VM. You can run 3, 4, 5 at a time, no problem. I routinely, in my day-to-day job, run 3 or 4 at a time. They're also encapsulated, so both VMs and Docker have that advantage that you're encapsulating your apps. Each one is separate from the other. If one's running PHP 5.6 and one's running PHP 7.1 or 7.2, that's totally fine. They don't affect each other. So that's great. You know that your dev stack is matching your production stack, and you have control of that, and it doesn't affect the other apps. They're composable, which means that you can say, I want PHP 7 for this app. I want PHP 7.2 for this app. And the Docker containers are easy to share. How many people are familiar with Docker or are using Docker as a local dev? Okay, quite a few. So probably some of you are the same people as the VM people, which makes total sense. You probably had a natural progression just like I did through those things. But these are a lot easier to share because the configuration is contained in a single file, right? So, and to some extent that's true of the virtual stack as well, other than you have to pass off the images on the virtual stack, which could be pretty big and make it hard to share. So here's the composability of these things. So at this point, I've made a decision. Like, you don't have to make the same decision as I do, but I basically said, okay, local stack is too much work. Like, it might be fine for everyone that's in this room, but it's really hard to scale that across your team. And I was the person who always had to go and help that person that their LAMP stack died. Like, their MySQL version was different than somebody else's because they upgraded it without, I don't want to say without asking, but they just upgraded it because they clicked yes on an upgrade screen. And then they're down. And they can't fix it, so they have to call me in. So I make the decision that, okay, I'm going VM, right? So, and then eventually I make the decision that I'm going Docker, and these are my reasons. So here's composability, right? So here's a Vagrant file, and that's fine, that's great, it serves its purpose. That's 71 lines of code. Here's a .lando.yaml file. So this is 8 lines. All right, so LANDO is, full disclosure, I work for a company called Tandem. and we make LANDO. So LANDO is a Dockerized local development solution. So that's the thing that I use every day. So the examples I'm going to give are LANDO, but you can use Docker without LANDO. You can use LANDO. I'd encourage you to use LANDO. It's great, but you don't need LANDO. You can use Docker without LANDO, of course. And in which case, this .lando.yaml file would be a Docker Compose file, which is still going to be less verbose than the Vagrant file and very convenient to pass off to other developers. So here we're specifying the needs of the application at hand. So this is a composable thing. You can say you want, PHP. What did we say here? 7.1. You can say that, and you could equally say you want PHP 5.6, and you could say different things in different apps, and that's the composability of your application. You're specifying the things that you need for that stack without affecting your other apps. Usability. So here's one of the reasons that I like LANDO. You can do everything that you can do in LANDO with Docker. LANDO sits on top of Docker. It's a wrapper to help for convenience. So you can type this command, docker exec -it client PHP, and run a drush command, migrate status. And that's a mouthful to type. It's a lot to remember. You can make bash aliases for that. That's all fine and good. But then again, you have a scalability problem. How do you get those bash aliases to other developers? You can version control your bash files in Git and pass those off to developers. That's totally fine. That's perfectly reasonable. But it is another layer of stuff. So with LANDO, you type LANDO drush migrate status, and that's kind of easier to remember. The person working on the app doesn't necessarily have to be a DevOps person. They're just writing a Drupal migration, and they know how to use drush, and they basically have to preface the existing commands that they know with LANDO in order to fire them off in the Docker containers. So that's an argument for usability. So LANDO is going to be my examples. Again, I think you can easily swap this out with, there are other solutions that do this. So people use straight Docker and Docker Compose. You can use LANDO. There's DDev. There's other solutions that go down this road. So this is my opinionated workflow that I do day to day. You can certainly take this verbatim, but you can also make decisions for your horizontal DevOps for your organization that makes sense, whether that's Docker, LANDO, DDev, whatever makes sense for you. DocCell is the other one I was trying to think of. And there's probably others out there. So if you have a code base, what you're going to do to get this into the Docker environment, in this case LANDO, is type LANDO init, and that's going to initialize, that's going to construct the .lando.yaml configuration file that I was showing you earlier. So this follows the pattern of git init or composer init, where you're initializing the application, in this case, to be Landoized or Dockerized, and then you choose. So we have start states that you can start with. You can write your own .lando.yaml file. You don't have to start with these start states, but if you're a Drupal developer, it's very convenient to start with a Drupal 8 recipe. Start with a Pantheon recipe. If you need Laravel, start with a Laravel recipe. So you type LANDO init. It asks you these questions, you answer them, and then it constructs this file for you. So in this case, the answers to the questions are, we're going to serve this application out of a directory called web, we're going to use a Drupal 8 recipe, we're going to name the application, and the end result of that is it writes this file, which you could write by hand. Instead of doing LANDO init, you could write that by hand. And then you can add to this file. You can put in other things, like if you want to specify a PHP version, or you want to specify I want MariaDB or Postgres or something like that. You can add to this. But this is a drop dead simple example of Drupal 8, which is going to get it's going to tell LANDO how to do the Docker containers. Once you do that, now that you have this .lando.yaml file, what you're going to do is say LANDO start, and that's going to fire off all the Docker Compose commands to start up all the Docker containers. So there it is, LANDO start. So here it's building the containers, and what it's doing is just calling Docker Compose. So if you know Docker, you can leverage that in LANDO. You can write your own Docker Compose files, mix them in with your LANDO files, and have it happen. If you don't know Docker, like maybe you're a front-end developer and you're really great at design and CSS, and you don't know Docker, you don't have any interest in Docker, you just have to know to type LANDO start. And that's the same across your team. Like, so that's some of the scalability. Anybody can type LANDO start, right? So once they do that, they have the same stack as everybody else, and they can write their CSS and do whatever they're going to do. So LANDO start pulls up these containers, and so in this case, what is it going to pull up? It's going to pull up the proxy server, a database server, an app server, and I think that's it. Yeah, for this. But you can have other containers specified in your .lando.yaml file. A popular one is to use a node container to manage your SaaS and things like that. So I do that. Almost every project I have also has a node container, or if you specify Nginx, it'll spin up a proxy Nginx. So in this case, we started a Drupal 8 app. So in a few minutes, you have a whole stack and a Drupal 8 app running. The other thing that's super convenient about this is you can commit that to version control, and then that's passed off between your developers, right? So when your developer A spins up all the DevOps, spins up the project, sets up the .lando.yaml file, spins up the team, they all pull down the repo, they have the .lando.yaml file, provided they have Lando, they can just type Lando start, and they have the stack and they have everything they need, whether that's the node dependencies, whatever dependencies they need. They have the right PHP, the right stuff. And of course, you could do that with a Docker Compose file, right? Any configuration file. You could do that with the Vagrant file too, but then they would need the VM images. So that's where it's a little bit less shareable, but still a good solution and served its purpose. So this allows you to share this configuration with your team. Everybody has the same stack. So that's a way that you can be efficient across people, across teams, across projects. So this speaks to the horizontal nature of it. So that first .lando.yaml file was, I refer to it as drop dead simple. This is a slightly more, I wouldn't say overwhelming file, but more whelming than the first one, of course, more lines, right? And this is supposed to speak to the composability of it and how you can customize this. What can you do to compose it? So what did we do differently here? So we have a name of the application, we have the recipe, we have the config, and that's all the same as what before. So now I said, under the config key, I said via Nginx, and that, of course, pulls in Nginx server. So if your production server is using Nginx, if you're on Platform SH or Pantheon or wherever, if you're on Linode and you have Nginx on production, you should have Nginx on your local. It just makes sense to have parity. So you can just say via Nginx, and that will swap out the web server from, the default is Apache, so if you don't say via anything, it's going to be Apache. If you say via Nginx, you're going to get Nginx. PHP 7.1, so I'm just saying I want PHP 7.1 for this app. Database, MariaDB. So if you're using Pantheon, then you probably want to use MariaDB because that's parity with them, although there's a Pantheon recipe which will give you parity with Pantheon. But wherever you are, if you're using MySQL 5.6, you could say MySQL 5.6 and pin the version so that all developers have the same version of MySQL or whatever it is. Xdebug true, that's great because for many years, whether I was in a VM on our local stack, Xdebug, anybody Xdebug users out there? Powerful? Useful? Absolutely. Finicky? Yes. Do I always have it working? No. And to be fair, even in my Lando apps, I don't always have that working successfully, but it's been a lot easier. It's the most success I've ever personally had with Xdebug, and it's very valuable to put a breakpoint and see what's going on at that point. Which data do I have access to at that point? So that makes it really easy, a lot easier than it's ever been for me personally. So I like that feature a lot. So here, the services key. This is where you're actually just literally drilling down into Docker. And if you know Docker Compose, you could go down this road. And if you don't know Docker Compose, you can copy and paste examples from GitHub that we have, or that many users have that are available. So I'm saying on the app server, I want to run this run step. So for example, I work with platform.sh a lot. So what I'm doing here, anybody use platform.sh? Anybody use Pantheon? So, not so much. So that's surprising to me, but Terminus is like the command line utility that you use to interact with the server. Platform.sh has a similar command line utility that you can interact with their servers. So what I'm doing here is piping that utility into the container so that I can interact with the server, pull databases, do things like that. But the point here is that you can make any run step that you want. So you might have a run step that, so for example, down here, I'm running Composer install. You can have a similar run step that says, as soon as I LANDO start this, run these set of commands. And one might be yarn to install your node dependencies. So you might have yarn install, you might have gulp, which builds the SaaS assets for you. So anything that you could run on a server, you could put in a run step here that just happens when you start the app. And then for tooling, I'm just saying expose this platform command that I just installed up here as a command available to this LANDO application, this Docker application. So if you type just LANDO with no arguments, like you get a list of things that are available to you. So on a PHP application, you're automatically going to have Composer exposed to you, so you can use Composer to manage your PHP dependencies. You're going to have Drush there. If it's a Drupal application, it's going to pull in Drush for you. It's going to pull in Drupal console. If it's a Drupal 8 application, it will pull in Drupal console. If it's a Drupal 7 application, it will not do that. It knows to do that. But this platform command is only there because I exposed it as a tooling command on the previous. That is there in this case because of this tooling entry that exposes this as a command for the users to have in this application. So you can put, of course, any tooling command there that you want or need. So you might expose a command called watch that behind the scenes calls. So this speaks to that one of the earlier slides where one project has gulp, one project has grunt. If you expose a command on all your projects that's LANDO watch, all of your developers can know that that command is LANDO watch, and they can know that that builds the SaaS assets, the CSS assets. But behind the scenes, it might run gulp, it might run grunt. They don't necessarily need to know. If they want to know, you can tell them or explain it to them, that's fine. But if they don't want to know, if they just want to carry about their day-to-day business, it could be LANDO watch on every single application and do whatever it needs to do for that application. So that's part of the horizontal scalability, that you're giving a same user interface across multiple projects to run the tools that are needed for that project. So it makes it easy, and it doesn't hide anything. If you want to know those things, you can know those things. You can find out those things. But if you don't want to know those things, you don't have to. You can just make them easy for your team. So how did we get here in this room? How did I get here to give this talk? Well, personally, it's because I invested in DevOps. And when my team or my company was like, oh, let's build this project and it's going to be great, and I was hearing a lot of words, I was hearing a lot of things about mock-ups and design, and I didn't hear how are we going to deploy this thing, I would always speak up. I would say, okay, we need servers, like this has to go somewhere. This is going to have an API, and we're going to interact with these things. Like, well, we need to invest time in DevOps, right? And everybody in this room probably knows that. So what I say is interject that into your company. Like, make sure it's known that we need a place and a budget and time to think about these things in order for our apps to be stable and efficient and scalable, right? Like, so I am always an advocate for DevOps. That's why I speak about DevOps. That's what I do in my company. I say, hey, don't forget about DevOps. Don't, until they're sick of me, right? They're sick of it. But they also recognize that, I play an important role. I'm raising my hand because sometimes the DevOps people don't speak up. Depending on your agency, depending on your role, you may want to or be less inclined to speak up. So what I say is, if you're in a leadership role, then make sure there's room for that. So here's the why. It's going to increase efficiency. It's going to make your staff more productive. You're going to be able to level up your developers because they're working in a stable circumstance, a stable set of tools, so they can focus on getting better at one thing at one time because everything else is not changing around them. There's lots of variables in development. We know this. Increase your confidence in your company to deliver complex projects. So there's lots of tools here that have to fit together to deliver a project. So if we invest in DevOps and get nice, elegant solutions that are containing these things for us, then we can be confident that we can deliver. Even though these things are complicated, we have ways to manage them. And that's where, in my mind, VMs and Docker have gotten us. We have these configuration files, whereas in 1996 we might have been, you might do apt-get install something and then apt-get install something else, and if you didn't write that down, you don't remember what you did necessarily. You don't know which thing worked and which thing didn't, which thing broke it. So that's where these configuration files are great for us. So thinking about DevOps is important to me, and I think should be important to people that are trying to deliver technological products. And then if you get really good at that, you can basically put that in your RFPs. Like, we're going to deliver you a stable project, and here's why. Here's our track record. Here's what we do. You can explain it in a few sentences. Like we encapsulate this development so that it's going to go to production the same way it is in development. Like, so it's a sales pitch, and it's and in some cases for our company, we are a DevOps consultant for other agencies to help them spin up these kind of workflows. So who's on the DevOps team? I say everyone. Like, don't silo. Like, everybody should be, like, I don't fancy myself as a front-end developer, but I do front-end development from time to time. I'm not super good at it, but I can. And if a client needs a 2-hour CSS fix, I can do that. It's not my favorite thing to do, but by doing that, I gain some empathy for what front-end developers do, right? And I appreciate them. Like, they're way better at it than I am. They're way more efficient. So anything that that's outside of your wheelhouse makes you more empathetic and more better on the team, I think. And I hear people say that a lot. Like, developers should understand project management, and project managers should know something about development in order to be good at their jobs. They're not necessarily going to be the most brilliant developer, and nor is a developer going to be the most brilliant project manager. Some people are great at both of those things. That's great. That's not me. I'm not great at both of those things. But I don't often hear people say that everyone should know some DevOps. But picture a postmortem on a project when you're doing a retrospective. You just launched a website, an application. What was great about it? What was not good about it? Sometimes in those retrospectives, I see DevOps being ignored, and that's again where I raise my hand and say, "Hey, let's include DevOps in that retrospective. Let's figure out what was good and bad about the DevOps. What can we change?" So I think everyone should be part of that. And if the front end developer is like, I didn't really like Gulp, well, you need to hear that, because the front end developer might not be the person who chose Gulp or set up Gulp. You may have inherited it because we use Gulp on every project, but to me that's part of DevOps. Like, if Gulp's not the right choice, then the DevOps people need to hear that so they can adjust the tech stack. So I say everyone. Thinking interfaces. So this is where I was talking about where you could expose a tooling command, like, for example, watch. You could call it whatever you want. So you could make a command called LANDO watch. And behind the scenes, that might run Gulp or Grunt, and people don't necessarily need to care. So your interface, the way you interact with the thing, is by typing LANDO watch. And then it fires off Gulp or Grunt or whatever it is for that application. So that's what I mean by thinking in interfaces. And that makes your team scalable. That means that the same person or different people can type LANDO watch and do the right things for the application. They just have to remember one single command, right? So changing that, the way your application interacts, so if I someday on my 4th project change LANDO watch to LANDO view some awesome scenery, that's a breaking change, right? Because if I don't tell the people that I've changed LANDO watch, I don't know why you would change something simple and like that to view the awesome scenery, but you get the point. If you change it out from under people, you have to document that, and you have to have a reason for that. So that would be a thing that you would measure. And my guess is in that circumstance that the measurement would be like, that's not a good change. Don't do that. So don't roll that out across your projects. As a matter of fact, roll that back in the one project that you didn't think that. But being aware of if you are going to change an interface that's going to affect multiple people in your company, on your projects and your orgs, then be aware of that and make sure that you measure it and it's a good change. So if you're thinking in interfaces, you're kind of naturally understanding whether or not you're going to break that. And the rest of this basically speaks to semantic versioning. People familiar with SemVer? So that's what Drupal 8 uses. You have Drupal 8.0.0.0, which is the initial release of Drupal 8. And if you do 8.0.1, that's a bug fix release. You're not breaking any APIs. You're not introducing features. So if you think about your software and your DevOps stacks the same way, you're going to force yourself to know when you have to update documentation, when you have to update all of your team members. So if you go from 1.0.0 to 1.0.1, then probably maybe there's some minor README changes, but nothing to shake a stick at. Nobody has to worry about it. You can, of course, say, we went to this version. Here's why. Fixed 3 bugs, whatever. But if you go from 1.0 to 1.1, there might be new features, so you might want to make a little bit more of a hubbub about it and tell your users, hey, now we have some more commands that could theoretically make your life easier. Make them aware of it, so you're documenting those. And of course, if you go from 1.0 to 2.0, then the API might change, and you might need a more formal means of communicating that to your users and your team. So thinking in interfaces, I think, kind of forces you down that road of semver and what are you doing to your users. You're thinking about the users of your DevOps. So don't be dogmatic. So just because Project 1 had Gulp and Project 2 has Grunt, don't be afraid to try Grunt. And if you compartmentalize these things, you can try those, and it doesn't necessarily infect your users too drastically because they still have LANDO watch to run the things. So that's kind of speaks to the point on one of the first slides. Is don't be afraid of change, but don't change too quickly. So don't be so dogmatic that nothing can change. It can be kind of easy to do that as a DevOps person. Be like, this stack works, and we're just going to always use that, which is true, but might not meet the needs of whatever project you're trying to develop for whatever client. So handling outliers. So sometimes you just have things that change that forces your tech stack to change. So if your tech stack is flexible enough, you can handle those things, and that goes to the composability and the horizontalness. Can you spread that out to your team? So if you change something about the tech stack, this project we're going to deploy to a different server. So in the government space, you might have a requirement that you are on your own hosting in house because you have to be so this server has a different tech stack. So we can handle that though because we put it into our compose, we put it into our .lando.yaml, and then that distributes across the team, and everybody can be effective going to that new and different server, even though it's different. So it might be an outlier compared to your other projects, but you can handle it because of the composability of your tools. Documentation. Nerdstein, he said it, and how many people have been frustrated by Drupal documentation ever? Yeah, I've been frustrated by it. And I totally get it for the reasons that Nerdstein stated in the keynote. Sometimes it's an afterthought. We're a community of volunteers, and we do the best that we can. And, sometimes I contribute to documentation. In fairness, the contributions I make is I read a documentation thing and I fix a spelling error. There's some people that are writing this documentation on their own time, doing the best they can, and they do a great job when it's there. A lot of it is that it's hard to find. So I say, don't do that when you're, when project 1 is your first project and you make that thing and you know everything about it, and then you go on to project 2 and some junior developer has project 1 and they're handling the maintenance request and there's no README, they're lost. That's not nice. Don't do that, because then what do they have to do anyways? They have to come find you, and then you're not working on project 2 because you're helping them with project 1. So write the README. And what I say is that your company needs a README. So I'm very much a list person. I love checkboxes. So if I know what my role is and it's defined, I'm happy. And does that mean everything about my job is defined all the time? No, it doesn't mean that. But it certainly means I have a core base to judge myself by, to go on a delta. And once you have that README for your company, you can it's a living document. You can update it. Your tools need a README. So that is so for our company, you know, we have our docs site for our company as a live thing. So docs.thinktandem.io, and it's completely public, and you can go here and read what our company README is and what we think success is and what we think developers should do and what kind of tools we expect them to have. And you can take that as your own README. You can modify it. You know, any continuum that you want there. You know, don't use it at all. You know, but there it is. It's public. And if you want to see what that is, that's our delta, how we judge ourselves. So our tools should have a README. So the README for LANDO is docs.dev.lando.io, and this talks about the recipes that you can use and the configurations that are possible, and how to get MariaDB, how to get Nailhog, whatever it is that you might need. So that's our README for that particular tool. And then of course we have READMEs for all our projects. This is my personal website, and it's a very simple README, but it speaks to the things that are different about this project. Once I have a README for the company and for the tools, now all I have to do on the application level is basically specify the things that are different about this project, because everything else should be the same across projects. So now my task here is simpler. I'm just going to say, hey, developer who inherits my application, if you want to deploy this thing, then here's how you do it. If you want to do CSS, then here's how you do it. So documentation. It's easy to let it slide, but I think it's super important. Pick good partners. So this is going to be different for everyone. These are partners that we work with. So we're leveraging containers for local development, and we're picking these partners to leverage containers in production. So some people might be using like Kubernetes to deploy their containers to their own servers. What we're doing, so these partner choices make sense for us. But what I would say in the context of horizontal DevOps and thinking about your partners is just think about it. Like what makes sense for your organization. It might not be these partners, but think about who you're choosing, whether that be Linode or DigitalOcean or these people or your own in-house servers. All of those things come with a cost, right? Your own servers, you have to maintain them. Linode is great and cheap, but you have to maintain the server and the OS, and if Heartbleed comes out, you have to deal with that. And these guys are great for their own reasons. They have their containerization, they have deployment workflows, so that's great things. The point here is not so much these specific partners, but think about who your choices are and what makes sense for your org, what makes sense for the current client and app. And then just continuously reevaluate. So this goes back to like that first slide about my expectations. Like if you're developing a feature, you're going to have these criteria. What is the feature? What's it supposed to do? Do the feature, code the feature, test the feature, deploy the feature. So do the same thing with your DevOps. Go through that iteration cycle. So now this is like one of the first slides, but the difference being all these stacks are now encapsulated inside LANDO. That doesn't have to be LANDO, that could be DDEV or Docker Compose, but they are isolated from each other. And the fact that this guy has grunt and this guy has gulp doesn't matter. If you type LANDO start, this LANDO start in this directory is going to give you these tools for that app. LANDO start in this directory is going to give you these tools for that app. And you're done. So you've encapsulated it and you're able to pass off that configuration. That's it. Thanks a lot. I hope shed some light on horizontal DevOps. I'm at Serendipity on Twitter and on GitHub. Here's some resources for you. Any questions? Yes?
Yes, I have a question. One of your slides, why invest in DevOps, is really interesting. One of the things that, when we are selling this, for example, to the executive staff or to people who make decisions, is one of the questions that might come up, well, what about security?
Yeah.
So, all of these sound great, but the security aspect is a piece that at times can be a challenging sell with the, open source DevOps.
Yep. So one super easy answer to that is choose a partner that is secure. So Pantheon and Black Mesh have certain levels of a thing that you can buy that meets government standards. So that has a certain price attached to it, but it's super easy. Like you buy that thing and it's secure and it's packaged for you. Other than that, you just have to point out that security is an issue, needs to be addressed, needs time and budget to make it happen. And the time and budget might be buy this Pantheon product, which is awesome, or it might be we need someone to figure out these steps that Pantheon does on our own server. So just, I would say that make sure that there's time and budget for it. Call it out. Yes.
So you mentioned some of the other tools that you can include.
Yeah.
Do you have support for memcache, Varnish, and Solar Search?
Yes.
So you could just add that in the YAML file and put it in?
Yeah, so go to docs.dev.lando.io, and some of the services and recipes on the left-hand sidebar will be Solar and Memcache and Redis and some others, Mailhog, lots of others, and then they will tell you how to incorporate that into your .lando.yaml file to have those in your app.
Question. I work on a team. We work for an agency that wants us to work on their laptops, Windows 7 behind their firewall. They wanted me to look into Docker a while back, and I said the older version of Docker is all we could use. We're not going to. Right now, we're working like a Monto CentOS local environment. What would you recommend if we want to go to really use the newest Docker release? Can we do it on Windows 7 behind?
Not really. I think there's a workaround that my colleague got for Windows 7, but on our docs page it says Windows 10 Pro is a minimum requirement for Windows.
That's what I told him.
Mike, who's at Pierre on Twitter, he is a lot more knowledgeable in Docker, and I think he did some work for somebody who was in a similar situation, but I don't know exactly what that is, but I would hit him up because he's going to know more about than I do.
But the main, I guess, computer people are using Macs then.
LANDO is cross-platform, works on Windows, Linux, and Mac. Works on all three, but caveat being Windows 10 to get the Docker support. Windows 10 Pro, I believe.
And beware of the Windows files.
Yeah, I'm not a Windows user, so I don't. I hear a lot of pain, but I don't know.
You have to have hypervisor.
Yeah, it says in our docs. It says you have to have that. Yeah.
Clicking through the Windows files. We do all of our.
Yeah.
Like Windows upgrade 10, so we're not using the projects, and they give you like their, I think I went when I was here, I wanted to pub it to provision, and that just kind of testing.
So the communication there would be to pin your version. So you know how in Composability you can pin the version and say Composability. You can pin the version of Varnish. When you go to specify Varnish, say I want the Varnish you want, or whatever it is that you want. And then that will stay the same. Even if the upstream changes, you're going to be pulling that pinned version. So that's how that mitigates. And then you have time to address and make the change if you so desire to move on to the next version of Varnish at your own leisure.
Can I ask one quick question?
Of course. Yes. Thank you. Yeah, because it's slower. Oh, you mean when it says extra by false, it still complains about it. That might be. You'd have to look at that. It might not be doing what it says it's supposed to. It might be a bug. I'm not sure. I haven't. I've never put extra bug false personally, so I don't know. But it could be a bug.
Can you put your title slide on and leave that up for a minute and hit stop on the record button?
When they look at the stats, it just says
Let me hit stop for you.